In a city of red roofs and green hills, beside a slow green river, there rises a dome. A great dome of terracotta and marble, hanging impossibly in the golden evening air, the most beautiful roof in the world. Let the city grow quiet beneath it, and let me tell you the story of the extraordinary 200 years in which Europe seemed, all at once, to wake from a long sleep, and to remake the whole world of art and thought and what it means to be human. We call it the Renaissance, a French word that means simply the rebirth. And it was a rebirth of beauty, of learning, of curiosity, of the daring belief that a human life, here on this earth, might be a glorious thing. It begins in the narrow streets of a merchant city, among bankers and wool traders grown rich, who chose to spend their gold not on war, but on beauty, and so set loose the greatest flowering of art the world has ever seen. It is the story of a handful of astonishing men and women, crowded into a few short lifetimes, who between them painted and carved and built and dreamed the very image of the modern mind. Of a quiet left-handed genius who could paint a smile that has haunted the world for 500 years, and who filled his notebooks with flying machines and human hearts and the whole workings of the world. Of a furious, lonely sculptor who drew a perfect young shepherd out of a block of flawed marble, and who lay on his back for 4 years to paint the roof of heaven upon a chapel ceiling. Of the rediscovery of the ancient world, of Greece and Rome, long half forgotten, as scholars dug old manuscripts out of monastery dust and found there a lost and shining wisdom. Of a wooden machine of movable type, in a quiet German workshop, that would multiply books beyond counting, and put reading into ordinary hands, and change the world more deeply than any king or army. Of ships pushing out past the edge of the known map, into oceans no European had ever crossed, and coming home to say that the world was far larger and far stranger than anyone had dreamed. Of a monk who nailed his protests to a church door and split the whole of Western Christendom in two and lit the fires of 100 years of religious war. Of a quiet astronomer who dared to move the earth itself, to say that it was not the still center of all things, but only one small world among many spinning around the sun. And of the players upon a wooden stage in a foggy northern city, and the poet who wrote for them, and who gave the human heart words it had never had before. We will meet merchants and popes, painters and poets, monks and murderers, astronomers and mad prophets, the most crowded and brilliant company in all of history. We will walk slowly through the whole of it, from the first cracks of light in a dark and plague-struck age to the birth of the modern world we still live in. It is a story of human beings discovering, almost with astonishment, what human beings could do, of a few centuries in which the West looked up from its long medieval prayer and saw the world and found it beautiful. There is no need to hurry through any of it. This is a story made for the soft edge of sleep. If it brings you some comfort, you might subscribe and let a new story come to you each night, but only if it truly helps you rest. There is no need otherwise. So settle in and make yourself warm and let your eyes grow heavy, and we will begin in the darkness that came before the light in the last cold century of the Middle Ages. To feel the wonder of the rebirth, you must first feel the long sleep that came before it, the 1,000 years we call the Middle Ages, that stretched between the fall of Rome and the first light of the Renaissance. 1,000 years is a very long time. 50 generations were born and labored, and were laid to rest beneath the same gray churchyards, while the wolves came back to the broken Roman roads, and ivy slowly pulled down the old aqueducts, and the world grew small. It was not, as people once cruelly said, a time of pure darkness. There were cathedrals and universities, saints and scholars, great faith and quiet beauty. There were monks who kept the candle of learning burning through the longest nights, copying out the old books letter by letter in their cold stone rooms. But it was a world that looked, above all, upward and beyond, toward heaven, toward God, toward the life to come. This world, the here and now, was merely the waiting room of eternity. This life, the medieval mind believed, was a brief and dangerous passage, a vale of tears to be endured. The body was a thing of sin, and the individual person mattered little beside the great eternal drama of the soul. A man was not encouraged to ask who he was or what he might become. He was a peasant or a knight or a priest, born to his station as a tree is rooted to its ground, and his one great business on this earth was to die well. And so its art, for all its glory, was not of this world. The saints in its paintings float flat and golden against skies of gold, without shadow or weight or age, more like holy signs than living people. No one casts a shadow in a medieval painting. No one grows old. No one turns to look at us. It was beautiful, but it was not meant to look real, for reality, after all, was not the point of anything. The learning of the ancient world, the poetry and philosophy and science of Greece and Rome, had not been entirely lost, but much of it lay forgotten, gathering dust in the libraries of monasteries, unread for centuries. Great works survived in single copies, in cellars and mountain abbeys, their pages gnawed by mice and stiff with damp, the collected wisdom of 1,000 years of civilization, sleeping in the dark, waiting for someone to remember it was there. And then, in the middle of the 14th century, out of the East came a horror that changed everything. A plague, the Black Death, that swept across Europe like a scythe and killed, in a few short years, perhaps 1/3 of all the people alive. It came on the trading ships, silent and invisible. It moved along the very roads that carried the wool and the spices, and no prayer, no medicine, no walls could stop it. Let us pass gently over its terrors. Whole towns emptied. The living could not bury the dead. Fields stood unharvested under the autumn sky, and it seemed to many that the world itself was ending. No calamity like it had ever been known, and the memory of it lay upon the age like a shadow. A whole civilization had looked into the dark, and it would never again be quite the same. And yet, strangely, out of that unimaginable loss came the first stirrings of new life. For the world that survived was smaller and shaken and changed. The old certainties cracked, labor grew scarce and valuable, wages rose, and men who had been bound to the land found they could bargain and move and choose. The survivors, having stared so long at death, turned with a new and almost defiant hunger toward life. There was gold now in fewer hands, and a restless energy in the towns, and a quiet, dawning question in the minds of thoughtful men. If this life is so short and so fragile, might it not also be precious, worth living well and beautifully, and to the full? It was a dangerous question and a wonderful one, and once it had been asked, it could not be unasked. And there was one small corner of Europe, above all, where that question would catch fire. A warm and sunlit land of quarreling cities and clever merchants, built upon the very ground where ancient Rome had stood, where every field might turn up a marble hand and every hill remembered an older world. It was Italy. Why Italy? Why here, and not in the great kingdoms of France or England or Spain, with all their knights and all their riches? The answer lies in the strange and particular shape of the Italian world, for Italy was different from the rest of Europe in almost every way that mattered. For Italy was not one kingdom under one king. Like ancient Greece before it, it was a patchwork of small, fiercely independent city-states. Florence, Venice, Milan, Genoa, and a dozen more, each a little world unto itself, jealous of its neighbors and proud of its liberty. And just as in Greece, that endless rivalry, for all its wars and feuds, kept every city sharp. Whatever one had, its neighbor must have finer. And these cities were rich, richer than almost anywhere in Europe. For Italy sat at the very crossroads of the world's trade, the gateway between Europe and the East, and through its ports flowed the spices and silks and gold of half the earth. A sack of pepper bought in the markets of the Levant might be worth a small farm by the time it reached the fairs of the north, and the men who moved such things grew rich beyond the dreams of any farming lord. Their wealth was made not by lords with land and swords, but by merchants and bankers, hard-headed, worldly men who kept accounts and lent money and traded in wool and cloth and coin, and who grew, some of them, fabulously rich. They invented the tools of modern business as they went. The bill of exchange, the branch office, the double-entry ledger in which every debt and every credit stood in its column, plain and exact. A new way not just of trading, but of thinking. And this was something new under the sun. These were not knights bred only for war, nor monks turned only toward heaven. They were men of the world, of the here and now, who took a keen and practical interest in this life, in beauty, in learning, in the good things that money could buy. A merchant's day was spent among facts and figures, risks and judgments, and a man who lives by his own wit soon learns to trust them. Above all, they took an interest in their own cities, in adorning them and glorifying them and outshining their rivals. A great church, a fine palace, a beautiful painting were matters of civic pride, and a merchant who paid for them bought honor and fame, and perhaps a little forgiveness for his usury, for lending money at interest still troubled the conscience of the age, and many a chapel was raised as a kind of apology to heaven. And all around these Italians, everywhere they looked, stood the ruins of a greater past. For they lived among the bones of ancient Rome, broken columns and crumbling arches, marble statues turned up by the plow, the shattered grandeur of an empire that had once ruled the world. Children played in the shells of amphitheaters. Goats grazed in the forum where Cicero had spoken, and half the churches of Italy stood on ancient stones. The medieval mind had walked past those ruins for centuries and seen only old stones, or the works of pagans best forgotten. But now, slowly, men began to look at them with new eyes, with wonder and with longing, and with a dawning question. What if the ancients had known things we have forgotten? What if that greatness could be reborn? For the ruins were proof, standing in every field, that human beings had once done greater things than anyone now living could do. For these ruins were their own inheritance. The Italians felt themselves the true heirs of Rome, living upon its very soil, speaking a tongue that was Latin's own daughter, and the thought took root that they might not merely admire the ancient world, but revive it and match it, and make their own age glorious in its image. It was not nostalgia. It was ambition, wearing the mask of memory. And so the stage was set. Rich cities, worldly men, civic pride, and everywhere the beckoning ghost of a lost and shining past. All that was needed now was the spark, and it came, as such sparks so often do, not from a battlefield or a throne, but from books, and from a single restless scholar in love with the dead. His name was Petrarch, and he lived in the 14th century, and he is often called the first man of the Renaissance, a poet and scholar seized by a strange and passionate love, a love for the writers of ancient Rome, dead 1,000 years. He was crowned with laurel on the Capitol in Rome, as the ancient poets had been, the first man so honored in more than a millennium, and he wept, they say, at the ruins around him as a man weeps at the grave of his family. He read the old Latin authors, Cicero, Virgil, Livy, not as dry relics, but as living voices, wiser and more beautiful than any of his own dark age. He wrote them letters, as if to friends across the centuries. Long, intimate, sorrowing letters to men dead 1,000 years, telling Cicero what had become of Rome, asking Livy for news of his lost books. He mourned that so much had been lost, the way one mourns the dead. And so he began to hunt, to search the forgotten corners of old monastery libraries for manuscripts of the ancients, moldering and unread, and to copy them and save them and bring them back into the light. When he found a lost letter of Cicero in a cathedral library, he copied it out with his own aching hand, and each such find was passed from scholar to scholar like news of a treasure ship come home. Others caught his fever. A whole generation of scholars fanned out across Europe, ransacking dusty libraries for lost treasures. A forgotten speech of Cicero, a poem of Lucretius, a manuscript of Plato, each rediscovery a small thunderclap, a voice of the ancient world speaking again after 1,000 years of silence. One hunter, a papal secretary named Poggio, rode from abbey to abbey through the snows of Germany and Switzerland, and drew out of a dungeon-like tower a complete Lucretius, a vision of a universe made of atoms, dancing in the void, that had not been read in 1,000 years. They called their new pursuit the study of the humanities, the study of what the best of humankind had thought and written and made, poetry, history, moral philosophy, the arts of speaking and writing well. And so we call them, and the whole movement of mind they began by a single word, humanism. It was, at bottom, a simple and enormous act of faith, the faith that human words and human works were worth a lifetime's devotion. It was not, at first, a rebellion against religion. Most of the humanists were devout enough, and many were priests. It was rather a shift of gaze, a turning of attention, for the first time in centuries, toward this world and this life, toward human beings and their works, their words, their dignity, their astonishing possibilities. Heaven was not denied. It was simply asked politely to share the room. Man, the humanists began to say, was not merely a poor sinner crawling toward heaven. Man was a wonder made, they said, a little lower than the angels, gifted with reason and beauty and the godlike power to create. To be human was a glorious thing, and the works of human hands, a poem, a bridge, a painted wall, were not vanities to be repented, but achievements to be honored. And to become fully human, they believed, one must be educated, steeped in the wisdom and eloquence of the ancients, in poetry and history and philosophy, in the arts that free and ennoble the mind. They founded schools where boys, and here and there, in the enlightened houses, girls as well learned Latin and Greek, music and manners, writing and rhetoric together. Learning was no longer only for monks. It was the making of a complete person. When the great libraries of the dying Byzantine East began to send their scholars and their Greek manuscripts westward into Italy, refugees from an empire crumbling before the Turks, carrying Plato and Homer in their saddlebags, the flood became a torrent. The West recovered, at last, the lost half of its own inheritance. The philosophy of Plato, the science of the Greeks, the full glory of the ancient mind, read now in its own tongue for the first time in 700 years. This was the deep root of everything that followed, this new love of the ancient world, this new faith in the dignity and power of the human being. It was, at first, only an idea, alive in the minds of a few scholars, passed hand to hand in copied manuscripts. But ideas, once loosed, do not stay in libraries. Soon it would burst out onto walls and ceilings and public squares, in color and marble and stone. And it would do so, first and most gloriously, in one particular city. The city was Florence, a middling town on the river Arno, not the largest nor the strongest in Italy, with no port and no crown and no great territory, and yet the place where, for 100 astonishing years, more genius would be gathered than perhaps in any city since ancient Athens. If the Renaissance has a birthplace, it is here, among these narrow streets and brown stone towers, in the bend of a quiet Tuscan river. Florence grew rich on wool and on banking. Its merchants bought raw wool from the sheepwalks of England and Spain, wove and dyed it into the finest cloth in the world, and sold it back to the very lands it came from at a handsome profit. And its bankers lent money to the kings and popes of Christendom, and grew powerful upon the interest. The golden florin of Florence became the trusted coin of all Europe, a small bright disk that carried the city's name into every market from London to Constantinople. It was a proud and turbulent republic, forever quarreling with itself. A city of feuding families and shifting factions, of guilds and councils and endless intrigue, where fortunes rose and fell like weather and exile was a constant fear. But it was also a city of fierce civic pride and a passionate love of its own beauty. A Florentine believed, with all his heart, that to be a citizen of Florence was the best thing a man could be. And above all the feuding families, in time, there rose one, a family of bankers, not noble by birth, sprung from country stock in the valley of the Mugello, who by wealth and cunning and patient generosity made themselves the uncrowned rulers of Florence. Their name was Medici, and for 3 centuries that name would be written across the history of Italy and of Europe itself. The first great Medici was Cosimo, a quiet, shrewd, plainly dressed banker who never took a crown or a title, who walked the streets like any citizen and kept his counsel behind half-closed eyes, and who, from behind the scenes, guided the whole republic by the pull of his purse and the web of his friendships. The votes were free, and the offices changed hands, and somehow, year after year, everything went as Cosimo wished. Cosimo understood something that would define the whole Renaissance, that wealth spent on beauty and learning bought a kind of glory that mere money never could. And so he spent lavishly on churches, on libraries, on scholars, and above all on artists. He is said to have spent on buildings and books more than most kings spent on wars, and when his grandson totted up the accounts, he found the family had poured out a fortune vast beyond counting, and judged every florin of it well spent. He founded the first public library since the ancient world, and filled it with manuscripts hunted out of every corner of Europe. He paid scholars to translate the whole of Plato from the Greek. He built and rebuilt churches and convents, and he sought out the finest artists of the day and set them to work adorning his city and his family's name. In his old age, he kept a young philosopher at his side, and would send for him as other men send for physicians. "Come and bring the book of Plato with you." This was the great engine of the Renaissance: patronage. The artists did not create in lonely poverty, as we sometimes imagine, waiting for inspiration in a garret. They worked on commission for patrons, for the Medici and men like them, for the guilds, for the church, who ordered a fresco as one might order a suit of clothes. This size, this subject, these colors, finished by Easter. And out of that busy, practical workshop world came the greatest art the West has ever seen. It was a bargain that served both sides. The rich man bought beauty, fame, and civic honor. The artist gained the means to work and the freedom, slowly, to become something more than a mere craftsman, to become an artist honored and celebrated, in a way no maker of images had been since the ancient world. Within 2 generations, princes would compete for painters as they competed for generals, and a great master would keep kings waiting at his studio door. And under this steady reign of Medici gold, Florence blossomed. Its churches filled with new paintings, its squares rose with new statues, its skyline climbed with new domes and towers, and to the city on the Arno there came, drawn by the promise of work and glory, the most gifted hands and minds of the age. Sculptors and goldsmiths, painters and architects, poets and philosophers, all crowded into a town one could walk across in half an hour. For a great flowering needs both the seed and the soil. The seed was the new idea, the love of the ancients, the faith in human genius. The soil was Florence. Rich, proud, competitive, and generous. A city small enough that every workshop knew its rival's work by heart, and every masterpiece raised the standard for the next. And from that meeting of seed and soil there grew, first of all, a revolution in the way the world was seen. It began, as revolutions in art so often do, with a problem that seemed impossible to solve. In the heart of Florence stood a great half-finished cathedral, begun by the grandfathers of the city in a fit of splendid confidence, and over its crossing gaped an enormous octagonal hole, wider than any dome then standing in the world, a space so vast that no one living knew how to cover it. For generations it had stood open to the sky, a civic embarrassment, rained on and pigeon-haunted, too wide to span by any known means. The ancients might have done it, men said, looking at the Pantheon in Rome, but the ancient secrets were lost. And then a short, plain, hot-tempered goldsmith named Filippo Brunelleschi stood up and said that he could raise the dome, and that he would do it without the great wooden centering that everyone believed such a vault required, for there was not timber enough in Tuscany to build it. They thought him mad and said so to his face. There is a story that he was once carried bodily out of the council meeting. But Brunelleschi had spent years in Rome among the ruins, measuring the ancient vaults with his own hands, sketching, calculating, puzzling out how the old masters had worked. And over 16 patient years he raised his impossible dome. 2 shells, one within the other, climbing course by course, brick by herringbone brick, each ring locking itself in place as it rose, spiraling up and inward until at last it closed upon itself in the air, for 100 feet above the street. He invented as he went, new cranes, new hoists, new ways of raising stone that engineers still study. He even arranged for the workmen's wine to be hauled up to them, so they need not climb down at noon. And when it was done, it was the largest dome raised since antiquity, a mountain of brick and marble floating over the city, a thing the ancients themselves might have marveled at. It stood as a promise made real, that the modern age could not merely dream of ancient greatness, but rival it and even surpass it. And Brunelleschi gave the age a second gift, subtler than the first, but in its way even more revolutionary. Standing before the baptistry of Florence with a small painted panel and a mirror, he demonstrated something no one had ever quite pinned down: the mathematical laws of perspective, the exact rules by which a flat surface can be made to hold a deep and convincing space, every line obeying its vanishing point, every object shrinking in strict proportion to its distance. It sounds a small thing, a trick of draftsmanship, a geometry lesson. It was an earthquake. For the first time, painters could make a wall dissolve into distance, could set figures in real rooms and real landscapes, receding believably toward a far horizon, obeying the same laws by which our own eyes see the world. Space itself, which had belonged to God, had been captured, measured, and laid down on a flat panel by the human mind. The flat gold heaven of medieval art gave way, almost overnight, to a window flung open onto a world with depth and air and light, a world you felt you could step into. Painting had learned, at last, to tell the truth about how things look, and once men had seen it done, the old golden flatness looked suddenly like the art of another world. A young painter named Masaccio was the first to seize the new power fully. A shabby, careless, utterly absorbed young man who died at 26 and changed painting forever. In his frescoes, the figures stand solid and heavy as real men and women, casting real shadows, grave and human, filling real space. The grief on their faces is real grief. For 50 years afterward, the painters of Florence came to his chapel to copy him, the way students copy a master, and beside his people, the old flat saints looked suddenly like ghosts of another age. And in sculpture, A fierce and gifted man named Donatello did the same for stone and bronze. He carved prophets so alive that men swore at them in the street, and he cast a young bronze David, slender and thoughtful and nude, standing loose-hipped with his foot upon Goliath's helm, the first freestanding nude statue made in 1,000 years, unashamed and beautiful in the ancient way. The Middle Ages would have clothed him or condemned him. Florence set him in a courtyard and was proud. For this was the deep meaning of it all. The human body, which the Middle Ages had veiled and mistrusted as a vessel of sin, was reborn in Renaissance art as a thing of glory, studied, celebrated, rendered in all its living beauty, as the Greeks and Romans had once rendered it. Artists began to study anatomy, to draw from life, to learn the body as a musician learns his instrument. For how could one honor the image of God, they asked, without knowing how it was made? And the human face, too, came alive. Painters and sculptors began to make true portraits, not holy symbols, but particular people, with their own crooked noses and shrewd eyes and private thoughts, individuals who had lived and could be known. For the first time in 1,000 years, we can look into the faces of the dead and meet them, person to person, the sharp-eyed merchant, the wary bride, the old man with his warts and his wisdom, and feel them look back. In a single generation, in a single city, the whole art of the West had been remade, given depth and weight and light, and above all a new and passionate humanity. And this was only the beginning. The revolution needed a stage on which to reach its full glory, and it found one in the golden years of a single golden man. His name was Lorenzo de' Medici, grandson of old Cosimo, and the Florentines called him, with reason, Lorenzo the Magnificent. He came to the leadership of the city at just 20, on the death of his father, half expecting to refuse it, and under him, in the last decades of the 15th century, Florence reached the very summit of its golden age. He was not handsome. His face was heavy, his nose flattened, his voice harsh and nasal, and he knew it and laughed at it. But he was one of the most gifted men of his age, a shrewd statesman who kept the peace of Italy by sheer address, a bold if careless banker, a fine poet in his own right who wrote verses in the Tuscan tongue that are sung to this day, and a lover of beauty and learning without equal in Europe. He ruled Florence as his grandfather had, without ever taking a crown, the first citizen of a republic that was a republic still in name, but a princedom in all but title, held in the palm of his clever hand. He survived conspiracy and war, when rival bankers and a hostile pope set assassins on him at high mass, and his beloved brother died under their daggers. Lorenzo fought his way to the sacristy with a sword in his hand, and then, having punished the plotters, went back to his poems and his philosophers. His court became the beating heart of the Renaissance. Around him gathered the finest minds of the age, Ficino, who had translated all of Plato, Pico, the beautiful young count who dreamed of uniting all the wisdom of mankind, poets and scholars and artists, gathered in his gardens and at his table to talk of beauty and wisdom and the dignity of man until the candles burned low. Men came from across Europe simply to have seen it. And he gathered the artists above all. He kept a kind of garden academy near San Marco, where promising young sculptors could study his collection of ancient statues under an old pupil of Donatello, and it was there, among the antique marbles, that he first noticed a fierce, gifted, difficult boy named Michelangelo, took him into his own household, and seated him at his own table among the philosophers like a son. In these years, the painter Botticelli filled Florentine walls with a strange new beauty. Pagan gods and goddesses reborn, a Venus rising from the sea upon a shell, her hair lifted by the breath of the winds, a spring dancing through a flowering wood, scattering roses. They were figures of a dreamlike, wistful grace unlike anything the Middle Ages had ever dared to paint, and they were painted, mark this, for the private rooms of Christian merchants, who saw in them no sin, but beauty and meaning and the springtime of the world. For this was the boldness of it, Christian artists, in a Christian city, now painting the gods and myths of the pagan past, not in mockery, but in love as symbols of beauty and wisdom, weaving the ancient world and the Christian one together into a single shining dream. The philosophers of Lorenzo's circle taught that all truth was one, that Plato and the prophets, Venus and the Virgin, were rays of a single light, and for one golden generation, it almost seemed that they were right. Florence in the age of Lorenzo shone as few cities ever have, brilliant, cultured, wealthy, alive with festivals and pageants, with tournaments in the squares and singing in the streets, with art and poetry and philosophy woven into the fabric of ordinary days. It seemed a kind of paradise on earth, and men who lived through it knew, even then, that they were living in a golden age. Lorenzo himself wrote its epitaph in advance, in a carnival song that all the city sang. How fair is youth that flies so fast! Let him be glad who will be. Of tomorrow there is no certainty. But golden ages are fragile, and this one carried its own shadows. The Medici Bank, for all its glory, was quietly failing under Lorenzo's magnificent neglect. He was a prince in everything but the ledgers. Florence had made enemies. France was stirring beyond the Alps, and in the streets of the shining city, not everyone was dazzled by its beauty. Some looked at all this worldly splendor, the pagan pictures, the carnival songs, the gold, and saw only pride and luxury and sin crying out for judgment. When Lorenzo the Magnificent died, in the spring of 1492, at only 43, the Golden Age died with him. Men said afterward that the peace of Italy was buried in his grave. And into the uncertainty that followed there rose a voice utterly unlike the smooth voices of the humanists, the harsh, thundering voice of a prophet of doom. He was a friar named Savonarola, gaunt, hook-nosed, burning-eyed, and utterly fearless, a Dominican monk from Ferrara who had come to Florence to preach, and who found, in that city of beauty and gold, everything his soul abhorred. From the pulpit of the cathedral, beneath Brunelleschi's own dome, he preached a message of fire against everything the Renaissance had made. Florence, he thundered, had grown drunk on luxury and vanity and pagan filth. Its art was corruption. Its wealth was rottenness. Its love of ancient gods was a sin against the true God. Repent, he cried, for the sword of the Lord is coming, and coming soon. And the great church shook with weeping, and hardened merchants went home trembling, and even the philosophers of Lorenzo's circle felt the ground shift beneath their feet. And for its wickedness, he cried, a terrible judgment was on its way. And then, as if to prove him, judgment seemed to come. 2 years after Lorenzo's death, a great French army poured over the Alps into Italy, the first of the foreign invasions that would break the peninsula, exactly as the friar had foretold. The frightened Medici fled the city, and Florence, leaderless and afraid, turned to the one man who had seen it coming. For a few extraordinary years, the Friar Savonarola became the ruling voice of the city of the Renaissance. He remade Florence into a stern republic of God. The gambling dens closed, the fine clothes and the worldly songs were banned, the carnival itself was turned into a religious procession. Bands of children in white robes roamed the streets, knocking at doors, shaming the vain, and collecting their vanities for the fire, and a new and fervent piety fell like winter over the once golden city. And then came the day that gave the whole strange episode its name. In the great public square, where the carnival had danced, Savonarola's followers built an enormous pyramid of the city's vanities. Mirrors and fine dresses, playing cards and dice, wigs and perfumes and cosmetics, musical instruments, books of poetry and paintings, some of them by the finest hands in Florence, and set the whole glittering mountain alight, while the crowd sang hymns around the flames. They called it the Bonfire of the Vanities, and the smoke of it has drifted through history ever since. It is said that the painter Botticelli himself, seized by the friar's fire, carried some of his own beautiful pagan paintings to the flames with his own hands. The man who had painted Venus rising from the sea, burning his goddesses for the good of his soul. Whether the story is exactly true, no one knows. But it is certain that he painted no more Venuses, and turned his last years to strange, fervent, sorrowful visions. The Renaissance, for a moment, seemed to be burning its own children in the public square. But such a fever cannot last. The friar's harshness wearied the city. The poor grew hungry, the merchants grew restless, and the young men grew tired of being watched. He quarreled with a corrupt and furious pope, the Borgia Pope Alexander VI of all men, who excommunicated him and threatened the whole city, and the fickle Florentines who had wept at his sermons turned against him at last. He was arrested and tried and condemned, and in the very square where he had burned the vanities, he was himself put to death by fire, with 2 of his brother friars beside him. And so the Golden City passed through fire and came out the other side, chastened, changed, republican again for a time, its great age of glory ending. The center of the Renaissance would shift now, away from Florence, southward to Rome and the popes, and outward to the other cities of Italy. The torch was passing, though the fire burned as bright as ever. But before it moved, the age of Florence had given the world one last and greatest gift. For in these very years, the years of the French invasion and the bonfires and the friars' fall, there were walking the streets of that same city, brushing shoulders in its squares, the 2 or 3 most gifted human beings who have perhaps ever lived. And their work was only just beginning. The first of them was born in a hill town near Florence, on a spring evening in 1452, the son of a young notary and a peasant girl, born out of wedlock, raised in his grandfather's farmhouse among the olive trees. He was a beautiful, gentle, endlessly curious boy named Leonardo, from the town of Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci. Because of his birth, he could not follow his father into the law, And so, by the back door of illegitimacy, the world gained its most extraordinary mind. He came to Florence as a boy, apprenticed to the busy workshop of Verrocchio, goldsmith, sculptor, painter, a maker of everything, where he learned to grind colors and cast bronze and gild frames along with the other boys. And his gift was plain almost at once. Set to paint a single angel in the corner of his master's picture, he painted a being of such tenderness and light that, the story says, Verrocchio looked at it, laid down his own brush, and never painted again. But Leonardo was far more than a painter. He was, perhaps, the most universally curious human being who has ever lived, a mind that turned with the same burning attention to everything under the sun and above it. Why is the sky blue? How does a heart valve close? Why do the mountains hold seashells? What makes a face beautiful? How might a man fly? All of it, to him, was one single question, wearing 10,000 faces. He filled thousands of pages of notebooks, written right to left in his strange mirror script, with the overflow of that curiosity. Designs for flying machines and diving suits and armored wagons. Studies of water curling past a stone, of wind and grass, of light on a curl of hair. Drawings of the muscles and the bones and the chambers of the human heart, dissected by his own hand in the crypts of hospitals by candlelight. He drew the child in the womb and the anatomy of a smile, and in the margins, between the wonders, he wrote his shopping lists. He wanted to know how everything worked, how a bird banks against the wind, how a river carves its valley, how the eye receives the world and the muscles move the face. He trusted no book that experience contradicted. Nature herself was his library. He was scientist and engineer and anatomist and artist all at once, and to him these were not separate things but a single, seamless hunger to understand the world. For how, he asked, can you truly paint what you do not truly know? And into his painting he poured all of it. Where earlier painters had drawn hard, clear outlines, Leonardo let his forms melt into soft shadow and hazy distance. Sfumato, the Italians called it, the smoke-like manner, so that his figures seemed to breathe within a real and misty air, their edges lost and found like edges in life. It is a technique so subtle that his paintings seem less painted than dreamed, and no one in 500 years has ever quite matched it. In Milan, on the refectory wall of a quiet convent, he painted the Last Supper, the moment Christ tells his friends that one of them will betray him, and the shock of it ripples down the long table in a storm of gesture and feeling, every apostle answering in his own way. Protest, horror, grief, guilt. He worked on it for years, sometimes painting from dawn to dark without eating, sometimes staring at it for hours and adding a single stroke. It is not a holy sign but a human moment, caught and held forever, the most famous painting of its kind in the world, even now, half ruined and fading on its wall. And upon a small panel of poplar would he painted a portrait of a Florentine merchant's wife, an ordinary woman, seated calmly before a dreamlike misty landscape of rivers and blue mountains, her hands folded, her eyes just meeting ours, with a faint, ambiguous, unfathomable smile. We call her the Mona Lisa. He never delivered her. He carried her with him, working on her year after year to the end of his life, and 5 centuries later the whole world still comes, in its millions, to look into her quiet eyes. What is she smiling at? No one knows, and that is the wonder of it. Leonardo understood that a smile lives at its corners, in shadows too soft for the eye to fix, and so her expression changes as you look, kind and knowing and distant and amused, always about to resolve and never resolving. He caught something in that face, some flicker of a living inner life, forever just beyond our grasp, that no painter had ever caught before and few have caught since. He was, by all accounts, a beautiful and gentle soul, tall, strong, graceful, famously kind, a fine musician and a wonderful talker, said to buy caged birds in the market only for the pleasure of setting them free. He dressed in rose-colored cloaks when others wore sober black. He loved horses and jokes and puzzles. He was left-handed, vegetarian, secretive and charming, and everyone who met him seems to have felt they had met someone unlike anyone else alive. And yet something in him was forever restless and unsatisfied. His very universality was his curse as well as his glory. His mind flew always onward to the next question, the next wonder, so that he left a trail of unfinished work behind him. Great projects abandoned, commissions never delivered, a colossal bronze horse for Milan that was never cast, its clay model shot to pieces by soldiers. Patrons despaired of him. He despaired at times of himself. Tell me, he scribbled again and again in the margins of his notebooks, tell me if anything was ever finished. He grew old wandering from city to city, from patron to patron, Florence, Milan, Rome, and at last France, where the young King Francis gave him a manor house by the royal chateau and asked nothing of him but his conversation. There he sorted his mountains of papers, drew storms and deluges, and died in the spring of 1519, in the king's own arms, so the legend says. The perfect image of the Renaissance man, the universal genius, who had tried to hold the whole world in a single mind, and come nearer to it than anyone before or since. And what he could not finish, others would. For even as Leonardo was painting his misty smiles, a younger man, 23 years younger, fiercer, lonelier, and in his own way even greater, was cutting his immortality out of solid marble, in the same streets, in the same years, breathing the same Florentine air. His name was Michelangelo Buonarroti, and he was, above all things and by his own fierce insistence, a sculptor, a man who believed that the finished figure lay already imprisoned within the raw block of marble, placed there by God, and that his task was only to chip away the stone and set it free. He had been put to nurse as a baby with a stonecutter's wife in the Marble Hills, and he liked to say that he had drunk in hammers and chisels with her milk. He had been that fierce, gifted boy in Lorenzo's garden, studying the antique statues, sitting at the Magnificent's table. He was proud, difficult, solitary, and tormented. He slept in his boots, forgot to eat, trusted almost no one, and quarreled with everyone. Patrons, rivals, popes. Another boy in the garden, jealous of his talent, broke his nose with a single punch, and he carried the flattened face all his life. But he was driven by a fire that never rested, a genius who worked himself half to death for 80 years, and outlived every rival, and never once was satisfied. As a young man in Rome, still in his early 20s, he carved a Pieta, the dead Christ lying across the lap of his young mother, out of a single block of white Carrara marble, so tender and so perfect, the folds of cloth and the slack weight of the body so true, that men could not believe a youth had made it. When he overheard visitors crediting it to another sculptor, he crept in by night and cut his own name across the Virgin's sash, the only work he ever signed, and he was ashamed of the vanity of it ever after. And then, back in Florence, he was given a vast block of marble that a lesser sculptor had begun and abandoned 40 years before. Cracked, weathered, gouged, and thought ruined beyond use. The Florentines called it simply the Giant. Out of that damaged stone, working behind a wooden screen for 3 years, hammering from dawn until the light failed, Michelangelo drew the David. He stands 17 feet tall, the young shepherd David, nude and perfect, calm and watchful, his sling over his shoulder, in the breathing moment before the battle. Every muscle and tendon, the veins of the great right hand, the frown gathering between the brows, rendered with a truth that stops the breath. The Florentines were so amazed that they changed their plans. Instead of hoisting him high onto the cathedral, they set him on the ground in their public square, before the palace of the government, as the very image of their proud, embattled little republic, the boy who faces down giants. It took 40 men 4 days to move him, and he stands in the world's imagination as the very image of the Renaissance itself. And then a fierce and warlike pope, Julius II, a white-bearded old warrior who wore armor under his robes and meant to remake Rome in glory, summoned Michelangelo to his service and set him a task the sculptor did not want at all. Not a statue, but a painting. The vast ceiling of the Pope's own chapel, the Sistine Chapel, a barren barrel vault of some 10,000 square feet, high above the floor where the cardinals met to elect new popes. Michelangelo protested that painting was not his art. "I am a sculptor," he wrote again and again. He suspected his rivals had arranged the commission to ruin him. The Pope insisted. The two men roared at each other like storms, and once the sculptor fled Rome altogether and had to be coaxed back. And then, for 4 back-breaking years, Michelangelo labored on a scaffold of his own design, standing head thrown back, the brush above his face, the plaster dripping into his eyes, dismissing his assistants, grinding his own colors, painting a ceiling for 100 popes essentially alone, cursing the work in comic, despairing sonnets to his friends even as he made it immortal. And what he made upon that ceiling is perhaps the single greatest work of painting in the world. The whole story of creation, spread across the heavens overhead, God dividing light from darkness, raising the sun and moon, hovering over the waters, the making of man and woman, the fall, the flood, and around them prophets and sibyls the size of giants, and beautiful naked youths, and the ancestors of Christ waiting in shadow, more than 300 figures, a universe of muscle and grandeur, and holy power, painted by a man who insisted he was no painter. At its heart is the most famous image ever painted. God, borne upon the wind in a swirl of angels, his gray hair streaming, reaching out a single finger toward the languid, newly woken Adam, who lifts his own hand from the young earth, the 2 fingers not quite touching. In that small gap of painted air lies the whole spark of life, the divine passing into the human, and no one who has stood beneath it ever forgets it. He was the last great giant of the age, and he lived long, to 88, through the reigns of 13 popes, long enough to see the golden world of his youth pass utterly away. Florence's republic crushed, Rome sacked, the bright confident dawn clouded over by war and reform and fear. And his own art darkened with the times, growing vast and troubled and strange, straining beyond beauty toward terror and awe. The serene young David of his youth gave way to broken, twisting, unfinished captives, heaving themselves out of the living rock. As an old man he returned to that same Sistine chapel and painted, upon its altar wall, a last judgment. A whirlwind of naked souls rising and falling around a stern and beardless Christ whose arm is raised like a wave about to break. The saved hauled upward, the damned dragged down, and on a flayed skin held up by a martyr, the artist painted his own sagging face. It is no longer the serene creation of his youth but a storm of dread and grandeur, the work of a man and an age that had seen the golden dream end. And at the very end of his long life, this greatest of sculptors and painters became a builder, taking charge without pay, for the good of his soul, of the rebuilding of St. Peter's, the greatest church in Christendom, and designing over it a mighty dome, echoing Brunelleschi's dome in Florence a century before. He did not live to see it finished, but it rose after him upon his lines, and it crowns the skyline of Rome to this day, one Florentine dome answering another across 100 years, like the opening and closing chords of the same great music. Leonardo and Michelangelo, the gentle universal genius and the fierce tormented giant. They met and disliked each other, and once were set to paint two walls of the same council hall in open competition, the whole of Florence holding its breath, a contest that, like so much else they touched, was never finished. They are the twin summits of the Renaissance, the two men in whom human skill seemed to reach some absolute limit. But they did not work alone. Around them, in the Rome of the warlike popes, a third great master brought the age to its serene and perfect flower. The third master was younger than the other two, a whole generation younger and gentler, and in his short life the most beloved of them all. A painter from the little hill town of Urbino, the orphaned son of a court painter, with such grace and sweetness of nature that it was said no one, in all his life, was ever angry with him. His name was Raphael, and his very name has become a byword for beauty. Where Leonardo was mysterious and Michelangelo terrifying, Raphael was serene. He came to Florence as a very young man and simply absorbed everything: Leonardo's soft shadow and living faces, Michelangelo's mighty bodies, and blended it all into a harmony entirely his own. Calm, balanced, luminous, seemingly without effort or strain. Other artists' work shows the struggle. Raphael's shows only the grace, as if beauty were the easiest thing in the world. He painted Madonnas of a tender, gentle loveliness that have never been surpassed. Young mothers in quiet meadows with their children, human and holy at once, so natural that one forgets they are visions, so perfect that they have become, for much of the world, the very image of the sacred. He painted dozens of them, each one different, each one inevitable, and 500 years of Christmas cards and chapel walls have not worn them out. And in the Pope's own palace, in a set of rooms a few steps from where Michelangelo lay painting his ceiling, Raphael painted his own masterpiece, the School of Athens, a great serene vaulted hall, filled with all the philosophers of the ancient world gathered in calm and noble debate. Plato and Aristotle walk together at its center, the old man pointing up to heaven, the younger spreading his hand toward the earth, and around them Raphael painted his own contemporaries into the ancient world, brooding Michelangelo as the philosopher of gloom, Leonardo as the very face of Plato, and peeping from the edge himself. It is the Renaissance's own portrait of itself, the marriage of ancient wisdom and modern art, at perfect peace upon a papal wall. For by now the center of the Renaissance had moved decisively to Rome and to the popes, who had become, in this worldly age, less like humble shepherds of souls than like magnificent Renaissance princes, worldly, cultured, ambitious men who kept courts and mistresses and armies, ruled a rich state across the middle of Italy, and spent like emperors. It is a strange truth that the golden noon of Christian art was paid for by some of the least saintly men ever to wear the papal crown. The fierce Julius II, who drove Michelangelo up the scaffold, and after him the luxurious Leo X, a Medici, a son of Lorenzo the Magnificent himself, who is said to have remarked, "Let us enjoy the papacy, since God has given it to us," poured out the wealth of the Church upon art and building on a scale never seen before or since. Rome, which had been a shrunken medieval town camped in the ruins of its own greatness, was to be made, once more, the capital of the world. And the greatest of all their projects was the rebuilding, from the ground up, of the Church of St. Peter, the ancient 1,000-year-old basilica over the Apostles' grave, now crumbling and leaning and too small for the Pope's ambitions. Down it came, to the horror of many, and in its place there began to rise the largest and most magnificent church in all of Christendom, a wonder to crown the age, though no one then guessed what its price would truly be. The finest architects and artists of the century labored upon it, one after another, across more than 100 years. Bramante, who drew the first great plan; Raphael, who directed it for a time; Michelangelo, who gave it its dome, and generations after them. And there rose in Rome, slowly, the vast Basilica of St. Peter as it stands today, its colonnades opening like embracing arms, its dome floating above the city, the largest church in the world, the very heart of the Catholic faith, built, stone by stone, on the ambitions and the genius of the high Renaissance. It was the summit of the age, this brief, dazzling moment, in the first 2 decades of the 16th century, when Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael were all alive and at work at once, when the wealth of the popes flowed like a golden river, when it seemed that art could rise no higher, and that Rome had recovered, at last, the glory of the Caesars. Men living then said openly that theirs was a golden age, and for once in history they were right. Could not last, and it did not. Raphael, the beloved and serene, died suddenly on Good Friday in 1520. On his 37th birthday, it was said, and all Rome mourned him as if a prince had fallen. His transfiguration, unfinished, was carried behind his coffin, and he was buried in the Pantheon, among the ancient gods at his own request. Leonardo was gone the year before. The great generation was passing, and the light was changing. And there was a deeper flaw beneath the golden surface. For all this magnificence, the palaces and the paintings, the towering new St. Peter's, had to be paid for, and the popes, to pay for it, reached ever deeper into the pockets of the faithful across all Europe by means ever less worthy of their office. Far away in the north, in cold little towns the cardinals had never heard of, that anger was gathering which would soon crack the whole church and the whole age in two. But before we come to that breaking, let us not forget that the Renaissance was never Florence and Rome alone. It shone in its own colors across the whole of Italy, in a dozen proud cities and glittering little courts, each with its own genius, its own painters and poets, its own light. For in that crowded peninsula, brilliance was a form of rivalry, and no prince could bear to be outshone. Above all there was Venice, the strangest and most beautiful of cities, built upon 100 islands in a shallow lagoon, her streets of water and her palaces of pink and white stone rising straight from the sea. A republic of merchants grown rich on the trade of the East, ruled by an elected doge and a council of nobles, proud, secretive, and stable while all Italy burned. Venice floated serene and golden between the sea and the sky, and called herself, without blushing, the most serene republic. Venice loved color and light as Florence loved line and form. Perhaps because her painters grew up watching sunlight move on water, and gold mosaic glow in the dimness of St. Mark's. Her masters, old Bellini, mysterious Giorgione, and above all the great Titian, filled their canvases with a warm, glowing, sensuous richness. Golden flesh and crimson silk, evening skies and pearl and velvet, light itself made into paint. No other school on earth has ever matched the Venetians for sheer splendor of color. Titian lived long and painted like a king, courted by emperors, ennobled, wealthy, the most celebrated painter in Europe for half a century. The Emperor Charles V, master of half the world, is said to have stooped to pick up the old man's fallen brush, saying that Titian was worthy to be served by Caesar. And in his hands the very act of painting changed. The brush strokes grew loose and free and visible, dabbed and dragged, sometimes worked with his bare fingers, so that up close his late canvases dissolve into a storm of color, and only from afar resolve into breathing, glowing life. Painters have been following that road ever since. And beyond Venice there were the courts, the small brilliant princely courts of Milan and Mantua, Ferrara and Urbino, where dukes and marquises, in imitation of the Medici, gathered artists and scholars and musicians to adorn their names. A clever marchioness like Isabella d'Este could make a small city into a capital of taste, hunting masterpieces and poaching painters with the zeal of a general. And princes measured one another as much by their libraries and their frescoes as by their fortresses. These princes were often hard and ruthless men, soldiers of fortune, some of them, condottieri who had seized their cities by force and held them by cunning and fear, men who kept poisoners as other men kept cooks. And yet the same hands that signed death warrants also paid for exquisite beauty. The same courts that seethed with intrigue produced the loveliest art and music of the age. The tyrant of one generation built the library of the next. For this was the strange doubleness of the Renaissance, and we should look at it honestly. A world of dazzling beauty and appalling violence entwined, of high art and low murder, of men who could weep over a sonnet in the morning and order an assassination by night. The age of the Pieta was also the age of the Borgias. The perfume and the poison came, sometimes, from the same shelf. It was gloriously human, and it was very far from good. At the little court of Urbino, high in its windy hills, the same town that had given the world Raphael, A graceful and cultivated society gathered in the evenings in the Duchess's drawing room. Soldiers and scholars, ladies and poets, talking, as the candles burned down, of love and virtue and excellence. It seemed to many who knew it the very flower of the age. And one of that company, a diplomat named Castiglione, wrote a book remembering those evenings, a book describing the perfect gentleman of this new world. The complete man of the Renaissance, Castiglione wrote, should be skilled in arms and horsemanship, yet also learned in Greek and Latin, a fine dancer and musician, a graceful speaker and a good listener, a lover of beauty and a maker of it, brave, modest, witty, and at ease in every company, and he should carry it all with a certain sprezzatura, an effortless, careless grace, as if excellence cost him nothing at all. The book was read in every court in Europe for 100 years, and the ideal of the gentleman it painted has never quite left us. This was the birth of an ideal that still shapes us, the well-rounded person, the Renaissance man, gifted in many arts and sciences at once, of whom Leonardo himself was the living, breathing model. To be fully human, the age now believed, was to develop every gift one had, body and mind, sword and pen, eye and ear, and to wear one's powers lightly. We still praise people in exactly these terms. The dream 5 centuries on is still the same dream. But not every mind of the age dreamed of graceful gentlemen dancing at Urbino. In turbulent, invaded, war-torn Italy, one hard and brilliant Florentine looked at the beautiful, treacherous, violent world around him, at the broken treaties and the poisoned cups and the cities lost through wishful thinking, and wrote instead the coldest and most honest book about power that anyone had ever dared to write. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and he was no philosopher in a tower, but a working man of affairs. For 14 years he had served the Florentine Republic as a secretary and diplomat, riding to the courts of kings and popes and captains, watching from close at hand the ruthless princes and cunning churchmen who played the deadly game of Italian politics. He had seen promises broken and cities betrayed. He had watched the terrible Cesare Borgia rise and fall, and he had learned, in the hardest school there is, how power actually behaves when no one is watching. When his republic fell and the Medici came back to Florence, Machiavelli lost everything. His office, his standing, and briefly his freedom, for he was arrested and racked and released a broken and disappointed man. And in his bitter retirement on a small farm outside the city, he passed his days among peasants, and his evenings he wrote in his study, where he put on the robes he had worn at court and stepped in imagination into the company of the ancients and questioned them and set down what he learned. Out of those evenings came a short, cold, brilliant book about how power is truly won and kept. He called it The Prince. He wrote not of how rulers ought to behave, but of how they actually do, stripping away the comfortable pieties, and looking at power with an unflinching, almost surgical eye. It is better for a prince to be feared than loved, he wrote, if he cannot be both. A ruler must learn how not to be good, and to use that knowledge or not according to necessity. Cruelties are best done all at once, and kindness is handed out slowly, a little at a time. He was not praising these things exactly. He was describing them the way a physician describes a disease. It shocked the world and shocks it still. His very name became a word for cold and cunning calculation, and for centuries men called the devil himself Old Nick after him. And yet what he was doing was, in its way, the deepest Renaissance act of all, looking at the human world clearly, as it is and not as the sermons said it should be, without the veils of medieval piety, and daring to write down the plain and often ugly truth. He founded, almost single-handedly, the cold modern study of politics, and whether we like him or not, we have never quite been able to unread him. For this was the deepest change the whole age had wrought, not in art alone, but in the very way human beings understood themselves. The individual had been born or reborn, the single particular person with his own name and face and ambition and destiny, no longer merely a soul among the anonymous faithful, no longer merely a peasant or a priest rooted to his station, but a self to be discovered, developed, expressed, and remembered. The medieval craftsman had often left his masterpiece unsigned, content to labor anonymously for the glory of God. We do not know the names of the men who raised the great cathedrals. The Renaissance artist signed his work and grew famous, and was courted by princes and wrote his own life story, for now the maker mattered as much as the thing made, and genius was honored as a kind of glory in itself, a fire kindled in a particular man. Men now dreamed openly of fame, of a name that would ring down the centuries, of glory in this world and not only the next. They wrote autobiographies. They commissioned portraits and medals bearing their own faces. They built palaces and chapels and tombs to keep their memory alive. To be remembered became a passion almost like a religion, and to be forgotten a kind of second death, a fear that would have puzzled a humble medieval monk, and that we, their heirs, understand all too well. And with this new sense of the self came a new confidence, almost a giddiness, about what human beings might achieve. A brilliant young count named Pico della Mirandola wrote a famous oration on the dignity of man, in which he imagined God speaking to Adam and telling him a wonderful thing, that he alone of all creatures had been given no fixed place and no fixed nature, but stood at the center of the world free to shape himself as he chose, to sink by his own will to the level of the beasts or to rise by his own will to the level of the divine. It was a heady, intoxicating idea that man was the maker of himself, a creature of infinite possibility, a little God upon the earth, bounded by nothing but his own choices. It gave the age its energy and its soaring genius. It lifted the human being to a height from which the whole future of the West would be surveyed. It would also, in time, give the age its pride, and teach later ages the hard lesson that a creature who can make himself into an angel can also, by the same freedom, make himself into something far worse. But before any reckoning, this new and restless human confidence would burst the bounds of Italy altogether and change the whole world in two enormous ways at once, by putting the accumulated knowledge of mankind into books as never before in history, and by pushing out across the trackless oceans to the very ends of the earth. The mind that had recovered the past was about to conquer the present. And the first of these two revolutions, quieter than any voyage, but in the end the mightiest of all the age's inventions, came not from sunny Italy at all, but from a workshop in a cold, gray German town on the River Rhine, where a patient, secretive, deeply indebted craftsman was tinkering with metal letters, oily ink, and a converted wine press, trying to solve a problem no one had quite solved before. For the whole of human history until this moment, every book had to be copied out by hand. A slow, costly, error-breeding labor, a single Bible taking a monk the better part of a year, hunched in a cold room until his eyes and back gave out. Books were rare and precious things, worth as much as a vineyard or a house, chained to the desks of libraries, owned only by the wealthy, the church, and the great. Most people who ever lived never held one, and if they had, they could not have read it. Then, around the year 1440, in the German city of Mainz, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg brought together a handful of existing ideas into one world-changing machine. The genius lay in the type. Individual letters, each cast in a hard metal alloy from a reusable mold, in their thousands, so that a page could be set letter by letter, locked in a frame, inked, pressed onto paper by a converted wine press, and then, when the run was done, broken apart and the letters used again, for any page, any book, forever. Suddenly a book that had taken a scribe a year could be printed in hundreds of identical, error-free copies in a matter of weeks. It is hard for us, who drown in words from the moment we wake, to feel the sheer force of it. But it was perhaps the single greatest change in the entire history of the human mind since the invention of writing itself, the moment at which knowledge stopped being a trickle passed hand to hand and became a flood. The first great book off Gutenberg's press was a Bible, beautiful, dignified, indistinguishable at a glance from the finest handwritten manuscript, and utterly transformative in what it secretly was. And after it came the deluge. Within a single generation, presses had sprung up in every major city of Europe. Venice alone had scores of them, and books were pouring out not in the hundreds but in the millions, on every subject under the sun. Now the rediscovered wisdom of the ancients, which the humanists had so painfully hunted and copied by hand one manuscript at a time, could be printed in 1,000 copies and carried to every corner of the continent, safe at last from fire and mold and forgetting. Now a new idea, a new discovery, a new argument could leap across borders in weeks and be read by thousands of strangers at once. Knowledge escaped the monastery and the palace, and began, slowly, unstoppably, to belong to everyone who could read. And more could. Ordinary people began to learn their letters, for now there was, at last, something affordable to read and a reason to read it. Literacy spread outward and downward through society. A reading public was born, and with it a new kind of world, one in which ideas could no longer be quietly controlled by a handful of authorities, but ran free and multiplied and found each other wherever the presses turned. The rulers of the old world did not, at first, grasp what had been unleashed among them. A machine that copied books faster seemed a convenience, a marvel, a good business, not a revolution. But a machine that copies books also copies ideas, and a machine that copies ideas cheaply and beyond counting is the most dangerous engine ever built to anyone who wishes to keep the world exactly as it is. For every established power rests, in the end, upon what people believe. And the printing press put the power to shape belief, for the first time in history, beyond the reach of any single throne or altar. An idea that had once whispered from a single pulpit could now shout from 10,000 printed pages in 100 towns at once, faster than any authority could ride out to silence it. The genie was out, and no one has ever managed to put it back. It would spread the light of learning across a whole continent and carry the Renaissance itself to every land that could read. And it would also, within a single lifetime, take one obscure monk's private quarrel with his church and blow it up into a firestorm that split Western Christendom forever. Both of these, the light and the fire, came off the same quiet German machine. For a tool that magnifies the human voice magnifies all of it, the wisdom and the rage alike. But the press was not the only way the Renaissance world was suddenly, dizzyingly expanding. For even as ideas were multiplying beyond all counting, so too was the very map of the earth, as small wooden ships, no bigger than a rich man's house, pushed out from the harbors of Portugal and Spain past the edge of everything the ancients had ever known, into oceans no European had ever dared to cross. The same restless curiosity that drove the scholars into the libraries and the painters to dissect the human body drove the sailors, too, out onto the water, the hunger to see what lay beyond the known, to know what the ancients had not known, to push past the last line on the map into the blank and terrifying white space where the old charts wrote, simply, "Here be dragons." For centuries, European ships had hugged the coasts, creeping from port to port, afraid of the open ocean and the long swells of the deep Atlantic. But now, armed with better ships and better instruments, with the compass and the astrolabe and the newly recovered geography of the ancient Greeks, and drawn by the glittering dream of reaching the spice riches of the East by sea and cutting out the Muslim middlemen, the sailors of little Portugal began, cautiously, year by year, to venture down into the unknown. The Portuguese crept down the long, hot, unmapped coast of Africa. A few more miles each expedition, past capes that had been thought the end of the habitable world, until at last, after 2 generations of patient daring, they rounded the stormy southern tip of the whole continent and found the ocean open before them all the way to India and the Spice Islands of the East. A small, poor, rocky nation on the edge of Europe had opened a sea road to the other side of the world. And then a stubborn, visionary, half-deluded Genoese captain named Christopher Columbus, convinced the world was smaller than it is, sailed west across the open Atlantic for the crown of Spain, meaning to reach Asia, and blundered instead, in 1492, upon something no one in Europe had dreamed was there. Not the Indies, but a whole unknown hemisphere, 2 vast continents and a new world, that would change the balance of the entire earth forever. The consequences were vast, and we should not pretend they were all glorious. The meeting of the old world and the new brought conquest, plunder, and catastrophe as well as wonder, the fall of great civilizations, the enslavement of millions, the sweeping away of whole peoples by war and by disease. That is a long and heavy story, and a sorrowful one, and it belongs to another night. But for the mind of Renaissance Europe, the sheer fact of the discovery was an earthquake as great as any painting or any printed page. For the ancients, Aristotle, Ptolemy, the revered fountainheads of all the humanists' wisdom, had known nothing of these lands at all. Here was proof, undeniable, standing on the far shore of a new ocean, that the modern age could know things the great ancients had never so much as guessed. The past was not, after all, a locked treasury holding all that could be known. The sum of human knowledge was not fixed and finished. It was growing, and men could feel it growing in their own lifetimes. and the world itself was suddenly vertiginously larger. The oceans crossed, the map redrawn every few years, strange new plants and animals and peoples and even new stars in a southern sky swimming up out of the unknown. The snug, closed, familiar world of the Middle Ages, small enough to hold in the mind, with heaven a little way above the clouds, was gone. And in its place there opened an immense, thrilling, frightening expanse whose edges no one could any longer see. Gold and silver flowed back from the new lands into Europe in torrents, unsettling old prices and old powers. The great trade routes of the world swung away from the Mediterranean, where the Italian cities had grown rich, toward the wide Atlantic and the ocean-facing kingdoms of Spain and Portugal, France and England. And slowly, without quite noticing when it happened, the little Italian city-states that had lit the Renaissance began to lose their place at the center of the world. It was a wider, richer, stranger, more frightening world than any European had ever imagined. A world in which the very horizon had been pushed back past all knowing, and every certainty seemed suddenly provisional. And a mind that could reach across oceans, and across the centuries, and multiply its every thought in 1,000 printed books, was a mind no longer content to sit quietly within the old boundaries of anything at all. The spirit of the Renaissance, curious, confident, humanistic, in love with this world and hungry to measure it, had simply grown too large for Italy to hold. It spilled now across the snow of the Alps into the cooler, grayer, more earnest countries of the north, where it met older and sterner and more inward traditions of faith, and there it took on a new and searching character all its own. North of the Alps, in Germany and the Low Countries, in France and in England, the new learning arrived along the trade roads and, above all, packed in barrels among the printed books, and there it mingled with something the sunny South had less of, a deep, brooding, personal, almost anxious piety, a hunger not so much for beauty as for God. The Northern Renaissance would be, from the start, a more serious and more religious thing than the Italian. The Northern Renaissance had its own great painters, and they saw the world with different eyes. Where the Italians dreamed of ideal beauty and heroic, godlike bodies, the Northerners loved instead the patient, tender, almost holy detail of the real. Every separate hair and thread and jewel, the grain of wood and the gleam of brass, a fly on a windowsill, a whole landscape reflected in a single convex mirror, the exact weary texture of an old man's face. In the wealthy trading cities of the Low Countries, the Van Eyck brothers had perfected the painting of oils to a jeweled precision no one had ever matched, layering thin, luminous glazes until their small bright panels seemed lit from within, every surface rendered with a truthfulness that borders on the miraculous. A merchant and his wife stand in their sunlit room, the chandelier above them, the little dog at their feet, the mirror on the wall catching the whole scene from behind, a whole world caught and held, glowing, in a space no larger than an open book. In Germany, Albrecht Dürer, a goldsmith's son with a genius for line and an insatiable curiosity, traveled south over the Alps to Italy, drank in its new learning, its mathematics of proportion, its pride in the artist as a man of mind, and he carried it all home. And there, in his engravings and woodcuts, printed by the hundreds and sold at fairs across Europe, he became the first great artist of the age of print, carrying the new art not to princes only but to any burgher who could afford a sheet of paper. But the deepest genius of the Northern Renaissance was not a painter at all. He was a scholar, a slight, sickly, sharp-witted, endlessly traveling Dutchman named Erasmus of Rotterdam, the most famous and admired mind in all of Europe, the very prince of the humanists. He belonged to no country and every country. Kings and popes courted him, and his letters flew across Europe like a nervous system, binding the learned world into one great conversation. Erasmus turned the sharp new tools of humanist scholarship upon the most sacred text of all. Going back to the oldest and best Greek manuscripts, he produced a new, corrected edition of the New Testament, so that Christians might read the actual words of Scripture, as near as scholarship could reach them, cleansed of the errors that 1,000 years of weary hand-copying had let creep in. It was a quiet act of learning. It would have consequences like an earthquake. And with a wit as sharp as any blade and gentler, he mocked the follies and corruptions of his own age, the lazy, ignorant monks, the greedy pardon-sellers, the empty mechanical rituals, the worldly and warlike popes who had forgotten the carpenter of Nazareth. In a little book written for a laugh in praise of folly, he let folly herself climb into the pulpit and cheerfully expose the whole comedy of human vanity, sparing no one, least of all the church. He was no rebel. He loved the church and wished only to reform it gently, from within, by better learning and kindlier laughter and a return to the simple teaching of Christ. He wanted, he said, a philosophy of Christ that a plowman could sing at his plow. But he had sharpened a great many minds and unsettled a great many certainties, and men would say afterward, unfairly and not untruly, that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. For the northern hunger was not, at bottom, for beauty and learning, as in Italy. It was a hunger for God, a deep, personal, anxious longing for salvation and for certainty, joined to a swelling, righteous anger at a church that seemed to have grown fat, worldly, corrupt, and far too fond of gold, ruled from a distant, glittering, half-pagan Rome that was busy rebuilding a marble basilica with money squeezed from German peasants. And the new learning had taught men to go back to the original sources and read for themselves. The printing press had put the very words of Scripture and the sharp criticisms of the humanists into their hands by the thousand, and a rising tide of resentment against the wealth and corruption of the church had been gathering for 100 years. All of it was dry tinder now, stacked and waiting. It needed only a spark. The spark, when it came, was struck by an obscure and tormented German monk, a miner's son, a professor of theology in a small new university in a muddy town called Wittenberg, who wanted, at first, nothing more than to correct one particular scandal, and who would end, to his own astonishment and horror, by shattering the 1,000-year unity of Western Christendom into warring pieces that have never been made whole again. His name was Martin Luther, and he was a monk and a professor, a man of thunderous energy and iron conscience, and, in his own soul, a man tormented almost to despair by the terror of damnation. Do all he might, fast, pray, confess for hours until his confessor wearied of him, scourge his own body. He could not feel that he had done enough to earn the love of a holy and righteous God, and the harder he tried, the more he felt himself condemned. And then, wrestling with the letters of St. Paul in the tower of his monastery, he found his answer, and it came like a sunrise. A man is not saved by his works, Luther understood, not by fasting or pilgrimage or good deeds or anything he can buy or do or earn, but by faith alone, by throwing himself empty-handed upon the free and unearned mercy of God and trusting it. For Luther, it was a lightning flash of pure relief, the lifting of a lifelong weight. The gates of paradise, he said, swung open, and he walked through. And it set him, though he did not yet know it, on a collision course with the whole church of his day. For the church of his day was, at that very moment, busy selling the forgiveness of sins. To raise the enormous sums needed to finish the new St. Peter's in far-off Rome, agents were sent through Germany selling what were called indulgences, printed certificates that promised to cancel the punishment due for sin, for the buyer or even for his dead relatives in exchange for a coin. As soon as the money in the coffer rings, ran the salesman's jingle, the soul from purgatory springs. To Luther, wrestling with the free grace of God, this was not merely a scandal. It was a blasphemy, a lie sold to the frightened poor. And so, on the last day of October in 1517, Luther did the ordinary thing a professor did who wished to start a debate. He wrote out 95 arguments, theses, against the selling of indulgences in scholarly Latin and, tradition says, nailed them to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, which served the university as a public notice board. He meant to argue a point of theology among learned men. He did not mean to break the world. Had this happened 100 years earlier, it would almost certainly have stayed a quarrel among theologians, been debated in a few halls and been forgotten, as such quarrels had been forgotten 100 times before. Reformers had risen before Luther and been silenced, and left no crack in the great wall of the church. But this did not happen 100 years earlier. It happened in the age of the printing press. Within a fortnight, Luther's 95 theses had been translated into German, printed, and scattered across the country. Within a few months, across the whole of Europe. Someone had turned them into pamphlets without his knowledge or leave, and the presses could not print them fast enough. A local dispute in a muddy Saxon town became, almost overnight, a continental sensation, the first great firestorm of the age of print, spreading faster than any pope or emperor could ever hope to ride it down. Ordinary people read Luther's words, in their own blunt German, and found their own half-formed anger and their own deep longing suddenly given voice, and the quarrel grew and hardened and would not be quieted. Summoned at last before the emperor himself and the assembled princes of Germany, and commanded to take it all back, Luther refused. Unless he were proven wrong by scripture and plain reason, he said, he could not and would not recant, for it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. Here I stand, the story has him say, I can do no other. He was declared an outlaw to be killed on sight. But he was not crushed, as every such rebel before him had been crushed. For the press kept his words alive faster than any authority could burn them, and, decisively, the German princes, for reasons of faith and of hard politics both, moved to protect him, spiriting him away to a lonely castle for safekeeping. And so, for the first time in 1,000 years, a challenge to the Church of Rome did not flicker and die. It survived. It spread. It became, in time, a rival church and then many. Hidden in his castle, Luther took the greatest of his weapons and turned it to its greatest use. He translated the whole Bible into plain, vivid, powerful German. A German so alive that it shaped the very language ever after, so that any literate plowman or housewife could read the Word of God directly, with no priest and no pope standing between the soul and its maker. The presses poured it out by the tens of thousands. The old monopoly on holy truth, held for 1,000 years, was broken forever. The revolt spread and splintered across northern Europe, into Switzerland under Zwingli and the stern, brilliant Calvin, into the Low Countries, into Scandinavia, into Scotland, and into England, where a king who wanted a new wife tore his whole realm from Rome for reasons of his own. Each land and each leader shaped its own version of the Reformed faith, and they quarreled bitterly even among themselves. We call the whole vast upheaval the Reformation, and it tore Western Christendom, which had been one body for 1,000 years, into warring halves. And the halves went to war. For more than a century, Catholic and Protestant Europe would tear at one another in the name of the same God, in massacre and martyrdom, in burnings and sieges and the long horror of religious war that would, in the next century, lay much of Germany waste and kill a third of its people. The bright Renaissance dream of a harmonious world, in which all wisdom was one light, curdled in the north into an age of holy hatred that no one had intended and no one could stop. The Catholic Church, shaken to its foundations, gathered itself at last for a great reform and counterattack of its own, cleansing its worst abuses, sharpening its discipline, defining its doctrines with a new hard clarity, and setting out, by devotion and by fire, by new preaching orders and by the Inquisition, to win back the souls and the lands it had lost. And in that harder, sterner, more suspicious new age, ruled by fear and orthodoxy on both sides, the free, playful, open-handed curiosity of the early Renaissance would find itself more and more unwelcome. And in Italy itself, the cradle of it all, the Golden Age was ending not in ideas but in blood. For the very brilliance and division that had made the Italian city-states so creative had also made them fatally weak, rich, quarrelsome, disunited, forever hiring foreign swords to fight their neighbors, and the great new nation-states beyond the mountains, France and Spain, welded together and hungry, fell upon the wealthy, defenseless peninsula like wolves upon a jeweled lamb. For more than 30 years, foreign armies marched up and down Italy, French against Spanish and Imperial, fighting their great wars for mastery of Europe on Italian soil, besieging Italian cities, burning Italian fields, while the proud little states that had led the world in art and thought proved, one after another, unable to defend themselves. Leonardo's great clay horse had been shot to pieces by French bowmen. It was an omen of what was coming. And then, in the terrible May of 1527, came the catastrophe that stands, for many, as the true death of the Italian Renaissance. A huge imperial army, Spanish soldiers and German mercenaries, many of the Germans now fervent Lutherans who hated the Pope as Antichrist, found itself unpaid, starving, and mutinous outside the walls of Rome. Their own commander could not control them, and they poured over the walls into the eternal city itself. For weeks, the shining capital of the Renaissance, the Rome of Julius and Leo, of Michelangelo and Raphael, the holy city of Christendom, was given over to a horror almost beyond telling. The soldiers plundered its palaces and churches, stabled their horses in its chapels, defiled its holiest shrines, held its cardinals to ransom, and put much of it to fire and sword. Let us pass gently over the suffering of the people. It was very great, and it went on and on. The dream of a reborn Rome lay in ashes and blood. The Pope himself, the second Medici to wear the crown, cowered in the great round fortress of Sant'Angelo while his city burned and screamed below him, and Michelangelo's own brother among the defenders. When it was over, Rome was half empty. Its artists had fled or died. Its workshops stood silent. Its great patrons were ruined or scattered to the winds. The confident, luminous world of the High Renaissance, which only a few years before had seemed to touch the very ceiling of what human beings could achieve, was shattered in a single dreadful season. Rome would recover in time, would be rebuilt grander than ever, would raise its great basilica at last, would fill again with pilgrims and art. But something had gone out of the age and would not come back. The bright optimism, the serene and boundless confidence, the shining faith that human genius was carrying the world ever upward toward some golden perfection. All of it was wounded, in that year of fire, past any full healing. Men had glimpsed how quickly the glory could turn to ash. The Italy that emerged from the wars was a sadder, poorer, more frightened and more subject place. Much of it now under the heavy hand of Spain, its liberties broken, its proud republics tamed or gone, its great creative fever passing like a sickness that has run its course. The Renaissance did not end on any single day, but after the sack of Rome, its heart was no longer sure of itself, and it knew it. And the very mood of its art changed with the mood of the age. The calm, balanced, godlike perfection of Raphael gave way, among the generation that followed, to something restless and strained and self-conscious, figures stretched impossibly long and coiled into strange, elegant, unstable poses, colors turned acid and unreal, spaces that will not hold still, a knowing, nervous, virtuoso beauty that no longer trusts the world it paints. We call it mannerism, and it is the art of an age that has lost its innocence and cannot quite pretend otherwise. The great confident dawn was over. And yet, and this is the wonder of it, the light did not simply fail. Even as the golden age of Italian art dimmed toward its long sunset, the deepest and most world-remaking fruit of the whole Renaissance spirit was only just beginning to ripen. Not in paint now, nor in marble, nor in poetry, but in the quiet, patient, revolutionary work of a few careful men who had turned the new, fearless, measuring gaze of the age upon the oldest mystery of all, the lights that move across the night sky, and the question of what they truly are. For 1400 years, everyone had known exactly where the earth stood. It stood, solid and motionless, at the very center of all creation, and around it turned the moon, the sun, the planets, and the sphere of the fixed stars, each carried on its own perfect crystal shell. So the ancient Greeks had reasoned, so the great Ptolemy had charted it, so the Church affirmed it, and so it plainly seemed to every eye that had ever watched the sun climb the sky. It was not stupidity, It was common sense, and it was very nearly universal. But in a quiet cathedral town in far-off Poland, a careful, cautious, many-sided churchman named Nicholas Copernicus, a canon of the church, a physician, an administrator, and above all a patient watcher of the heavens, spent the long nights of his life measuring the wandering of the planets. And slowly, reluctantly, he came to a conclusion so strange, so contrary to all common sense and all authority, that he scarcely dared to write it down, and dared even less to publish it. The tangled motions of the planets, he found, the way they seemed to stop and drift backward and loop upon themselves, all fell into a beautiful, simple order the moment one imagined not the Earth, but the Sun, standing still at the center, with the Earth itself demoted to a mere planet, the third of them, turning daily on its own axis as it swung year by year around the Sun along with all the rest. What had been a groaning machinery of dozens of spheres became one clean, elegant idea. It was a shattering thought, and Copernicus knew it. It tore the Earth and humankind standing upon it, out of the still center of the universe, the place God had surely made for his chief creation, and set it spinning and flying through space as one small wanderer among many. It contradicted the plain evidence of the senses, the settled wisdom of the ancients, and the reading of Scripture, all three at once. Small wonder that he held it back. Copernicus, a prudent man, sat on his great book for most of his life, sharing it only with a few trusted friends, dedicating it warily to the Pope, wrapping it in cautious words. It is said that the first printed copy was placed in his hands only on the very day he lay dying, an old man, his life's work reaching him just as he left the world. He never had to face the storm his quiet idea would raise. But the idea was loose now, printed and unkillable, carried on the same press that carried Luther, and it would not be put back into its box. For here, in truth, was the ultimate flowering of the whole Renaissance spirit, the very same spirit that had dug the ancients out of the dust, and questioned the authority of the schoolmen, and dissected the human body, and measured the vanishing point, and sailed past the edge of the map, now turned at last upon the sky itself. If the great question of the age was what human reason, looking freshly at the world, might discover for itself, here was that question's most breathtaking answer. And it was answered in a wholly new way, a way that would matter even more than the answer. This was knowledge won not from ancient books, nor from the authority of church or schoolroom, but from patient observation and careful measurement and reasoning tested, humbly and relentlessly, against the evidence of the world itself. It is the method we now call science, and it was being born in these very years out of the marriage of Renaissance curiosity with Renaissance daring. The old, comfortable, closed universe, snug and finite, the Earth at its warm center and heaven a little way beyond the outermost sphere, was cracking open into something vast and cold and thrilling almost beyond bearing. A cosmos of immense, perhaps endless distances of countless suns, in which the Earth was not the throne of creation but a moving speck. It was frightening, and it was magnificent, and once it had been seen, it could never be unseen. Copernicus had opened the door, but only a crack and quietly, and with the sun still ringed by his tidy spheres. It would fall to others in the century to come to fling that door wide open. and one of them, an Italian, sharp-tongued and fearless, with a new instrument of ground glass in his hand, would do something no human being in all the long ages of the world had ever done before. He would point it at the night sky and see. But before we follow the new science out to its dangerous frontier, let us pause a while, in the later 16th century, in the long golden afternoon of the Renaissance. For though its bright Florentine morning was long past, and Italy lay wounded and subdued, the light it had kindled had spread by now across the whole of Europe, and would shine on, in changing colors, for another 100 years and more. A great fire does not go out the moment the wind changes. Venice, safe upon her lagoon while the rest of Italy suffered under foreign armies, glowed on serenely in her long, magnificent sunset. The aged Titian painted into his 90s, and after him Tintoretto worked like a man possessed, filling whole halls with vast, dark, lightning-lit canvases, and stately Veronese spread out his silver banquets and marble terraces crowded with silk and sunlight, the last great blaze of Italian color, richer and more theatrical than anything that had come before. The music of the age flowered too, and reached its own perfection. The soaring, interweaving, many-voiced choral music of masters like Palestrina, in which a dozen independent melodies climb and cross and resolve into a single shining harmony, filling the great churches with a sound like ordered light. And in these same years, in Florence, a handful of scholars trying to revive the drama of the ancient Greeks stumbled instead into something new, solo song over instruments, story sung upon a stage, and without quite meaning to, invented the opera. And the ideal born in Italy, of the cultivated, learned, many-gifted human being, at home in every art, spread outward now to every court and country in Europe. Kings and queens learned to write verse and play the lute and read their Latin. Nobles gathered libraries and cabinets of curiosities, and to be thought merely a fighter, and no more, became a kind of shame. The whole idea of what an educated, civilized, fully realized person should be had been quietly remade, and would stay remade. For the Renaissance, in the end, was never only a handful of great masterpieces hanging on a handful of walls. It was a whole new way of being human, curious, cultivated, self-aware, in love with beauty and learning and the fullness of this one earthly life, hungry to know and to make and to be remembered. And that way of being had now sunk its roots across an entire continent, into its schools and its courts and its counting houses, and it would never again be pulled up. Everywhere the new spirit bred new questions and new sciences. Physicians at last cut open the human body and drew it as it truly is, overturning errors 1,000 years old. Naturalists began to gather and name the plants and animals of the swelling world. Mapmakers redrew the earth. Scholars questioned old histories and old laws with fresh and skeptical eyes. The whole inheritance of the past was being re-examined, and the whole present thrown open to patient, hopeful inquiry. And everywhere the printed book carried it, tireless and multiplying. The presses never stopped, and the number of books in the world, which for 1,000 years had crept upward by painful handfuls of hand-copied volumes, now doubled and doubled again and again, until a modestly prosperous merchant might keep on his own shelves more books than a great medieval monastery had guarded as treasure. Knowledge had become, for the first time, a thing that grows. and that, perhaps, was the deepest change of all, deeper than any single discovery. The old world had believed, in its bones, that all the truths that mattered were already known, handed down complete from the ancients and the scriptures, to be preserved and honored and passed on, but not added to, that to be wise was to remember. The new world born of the Renaissance believed, with a growing and intoxicating confidence, the opposite, that the sum of human knowledge could grow, that there were new lands, new stars, new truths still waiting out there in the dark to be found by those bold enough to look. And in one cool, damp, rising kingdom on the far northwestern edge of the continent, a small foggy island that Italy had barely thought about at all, this restless new spirit reached a late and utterly dazzling flowering. Not chiefly in paint now, nor marble, nor the measuring of the heavens, but in the one art that the English have loved above all others, before and since, the living, glittering, inexhaustible art of words. The island was England, and the age was that of its great Queen Elizabeth, a shrewd, proud, superbly educated woman who could turn a Latin oration or a cutting jest with equal ease, and who steered her small, poor, threatened kingdom through 40 dangerous years into confidence and glory. Under her, secure at last and swelling with pride after the defeat of the mighty Spanish Armada, England came fully and suddenly into the light of the Renaissance. It was a confident, expansive, seagoing, adventurous age, of captains like Drake sailing clean around the world and coming home with holds full of Spanish gold, of new colonies dreamed of across the Atlantic, of a young nation discovering its own strength and its own voice. And all that restless energy and swagger and delight poured itself, above everything, into a sudden, astonishing, unrepeatable explosion of poetry, and most of all of drama. For in the crowded, stinking, brawling, brilliant city of London there had arisen a wholly new thing: the public playhouse, great round wooden theaters open to the sky, where for a penny at the door thousands of ordinary people, apprentices and sailors and fine ladies and cut purses all crushed in together, stood or sat to watch living actors bring the whole vast range of human life up onto a bare wooden stage, in broad afternoon daylight. And writing for those hungry theaters was a company of poets of the most extraordinary gift, Marlowe with his mighty line, and a dozen others, and one among them, a glover's son from a small market town, with no university and no high birth and no great learning of the schools, who became, by common consent, the greatest writer in the history of the English tongue, and perhaps the greatest in any tongue that has ever been spoken. His name was William Shakespeare. He took the whole inheritance of the Renaissance, its rediscovered ancient histories, its Italian tales and Roman plots, its humanist learning worn lightly, its deep new fascination with the single human soul, and poured all of it into plays of such range and depth and beauty that 4 full centuries of the closest attention have not exhausted them, nor even come near. Kings and beggars, generals and fools, murderers, lovers, ghosts, and clowns crowd his stage, and every one of them is fully, achingly alive. He wrote of ambition that devours itself, and jealousy that poisons love, and old age betrayed by its own children, and young love dead before its morning, of grief and mercy and terror and helpless laughter. And above all, he did the deepest Renaissance thing of all, carried to a height no one had reached before or has reached since. He looked into the human heart, the private, particular, contradictory, self-questioning inner life of the individual person, and he showed it to itself whole as if for the first time. His Prince Hamlet stands alone upon the stage and marvels aloud at the strange creature that is man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in action how like an angel, in apprehension how like a god, and then, in the same breath, finds it all no more to him than dust, and wonders whether it is nobler to endure this life or to end it, in words that have become the very voice of the questioning, self-aware, modern mind talking to itself in the dark. This is Renaissance humanism grown at last into poetry, the human being turning to gaze, with wonder and with dread, full upon itself. For that, in the end, was the great gift of the whole long age, this new and tender and unblinking attention to the inner life of the single human being. This revolutionary sense that each ordinary person is a whole deep world, unrepeatable, worthy of the closest and most loving care. It had begun 200 years before, with a few scholars falling in love with the individual voices of the dead. It reached its very summit here, on a bare wooden stage in a muddy northern city, in the words of a country glover's son. And so what the Italian painters had done for the human face and the human body, given it back its weight and its light and its living particular truth, Shakespeare and his fellow poets now did for the human mind and heart, rendering them in all their depth and contradiction, their grandeur and their folly, their restless, searching, unquiet, unmistakably modern life. The mirror the Renaissance had first held up to the outward world was turned, at last, fully inward. The theater of Elizabethan England was, in a deep sense, the whole Renaissance come round full circle. It had all begun with a longing to bring the drama and the glory of ancient Greece and Rome back to life after 1,000 years asleep. And here, at the far end of it, on a foggy island the Romans had once thought the edge of the world, that ancient art was reborn in a new tongue, for a new and boisterous people, and carried to heights the ancients themselves had perhaps never quite reached. It was one of the last, and loveliest, and most enduring flowers of the age. And even as the poets wrote and the crowds laughed and wept in the London playhouses, far away to the south, in the Italy where it had all first begun, an aging man was standing on a rooftop in the dark, pointing a slender tube of ground glass up at the moon and the wandering stars, and quietly, patiently, night after night, bringing the whole long day of the Renaissance to its close and opening the door to the modern age that would follow. His name was Galileo Galilei, a professor of mathematics in Padua and Pisa, a man of restless brilliance, sharp wit and sharper tongue, a lover of argument who made friends and enemies with equal ease. He was born in the very year that Michelangelo died, as though the age of art had reached out and handed its torch, across a single night, to the age of science, and he would carry it further than anyone yet dreamed. He heard, one day in 1609, of a curious new toy lately made by the spectacle grinders of the Low Countries, a tube fitted with two lenses that made far-off things seem near. Grasping at once what it might be worth, he built one of his own, and then a far better one, grinding the lenses with his own hands until they magnified not 3 times but 20-30. And then he did the simple, world-changing thing that, incredibly, no one had quite done before. Instead of spying on distant ships, he turned it upward at the night sky. And there, through that little tube of glass, he saw wonders that no human eye in all of history had ever seen. He looked at the moon, that perfect, smooth, unchanging silver disk of the philosophers, and saw a world, a rugged world like our own, with mountains that caught the sunrise on their peaks while the valleys lay in shadow, with plains and craters and great dark seas. The heavens, it turned out, were not made of some perfect changeless substance after all. They were made of stuff like the earth. He turned his glass on Jupiter and saw 4 little points of light strung out beside it, and watched night after night as they danced from one side of the planet to the other. They were moons, for moons circling Jupiter as our moon circles us, plain, undeniable proof, there for anyone to see, that not everything in the heavens turned around the earth. He looked at the hazy band of the Milky Way and found it broke apart, in his lens, into countless separate stars, more than anyone had ever imagined. He saw Venus show phases like the moon, and dark spots crawl across the face of the sun itself. Everything he saw pointed the same way, and confirmed the quiet guess that Copernicus had scarcely dared to whisper. The old picture of the heavens was simply wrong. The earth was not the still center of a perfect, finished cosmos. It was a planet, one among others, in a universe far vaster and stranger and more open than the ancients or the church had ever taught. And Galileo, unlike the cautious, dying Copernicus, was not a man built to keep such a thing quietly to himself. He published what he had seen swiftly, in plain and vivid Italian rather than scholars' Latin, for all the world to read. He demonstrated his glass from the rooftops to astonished crowds. He argued and boasted and skewered his opponents with a wit that delighted the public and made him bitter, powerful enemies. And in the hardened, anxious, embattled atmosphere of the Counter-Reformation, a church fighting for its very life against the Protestants, so loud and public a challenge to the settled order of the heavens could not, in the end, be allowed to stand. And so the old world and the new collided at last, face to face, in a Roman courtroom. Galileo, an old man now, ill and world-famous, was summoned before the Inquisition, shown the instruments of the question, and made to kneel upon the stone floor and declare aloud, with his hand upon the Gospels, that the earth did not move, to deny, with his own lips and under threat, the very truth he had seen with his own eyes through his own glass. He submitted. He was an old man and no martyr. He had seen what happened to those who did not bend, and he judged, perhaps rightly, that a living scientist could serve the truth better than a dead one. He lived out his last years a prisoner in his own villa, watched, forbidden to teach, and at the end quite blind, the eyes that had seen more of the heavens than any man before him gone dark. Legend says that as he rose from his knees, having sworn that the earth stood still, he muttered under his breath, "And yet it moves." Whether he truly said it, no one knows. But the earth moved on regardless, exactly as he had known it must. For the truth he had seen could not be unseen, nor a whispered confession undiscover the moons of Jupiter. His books were smuggled north and printed in the free Protestant lands. His discoveries spread from hand to hand, and the new way of knowing the world, by looking and measuring and reasoning and testing every claim against the stubborn evidence of things, could no longer be stopped by any court or creed. Galileo is rightly called the father of modern science, and with him the Renaissance passes over at last into the great scientific revolution that would remake the world entire. And it is a fitting close. For the Renaissance had begun 300 years before, with men turning to look backward, in love and longing, at the lost golden wisdom of the ancients, certain that the greatest things had already been done. It ended with a man turning to look upward, through a tube of glass, at truths the ancients had never so much as dreamed, and finding, at the far end of all that reverence for the past, that the greatest wisdom lay not behind us after all, in some vanished golden age, but ahead, in all that was still waiting in the dark to be discovered. The rebirth of the old had given birth, in the end, to something wholly and permanently new. The long love affair with the ancient world had taught Europe, almost without meaning to, how to question and how to look and how to reason for itself. And having once learned those things, it could not stop and did not stop, but went on questioning and looking and reasoning, straight out of the Renaissance and into the modern age and down all the years between that time and this, and into the very world in which you are lying now, listening in the dark. And so, gently, across the closing years of the 16th century and on into the 17th, the Renaissance came at last to its end. Not with a single death or a single day, but with a long, slow, imperceptible fading, the way a golden afternoon dims into evening and you cannot say the moment the light changed, only that at some point the lamps are lit and it is another time of day. The hard new age of religious war and stern reform, of orthodoxy and inquisition on every side, had less and less patience for the free, playful, open-handed humanism of the golden years. The Church, on its guard, drew up its long lists of forbidden books. Scholars learned to watch their words. The wide, wandering, fearless curiosity of the early Renaissance grew careful and quieter, and in some places afraid. A door that had stood open for 2 centuries was, in many rooms, drawn softly closed. Italy itself, where the whole marvel had begun, sank into a long, gentle, impoverished twilight, divided, largely ruled by foreign crowns. Its great banks failed, its trade routes emptied by the ocean voyages, its creative fire burned down to warm embers. It became, in time, a museum and a memory, a land men traveled to in order to see what had once been done there. The workshop of the world had passed its tools to the rising nations of the North and the West. And the whole center of gravity of European life moved with it, north and west, to France and the Netherlands and England, to the great ocean-facing powers whose ships now ruled a widening world and whose merchants counted its new wealth. It was they who would carry the vast inheritance of the Renaissance forward now, into the ages of science and reason and revolution still to come, and shape it into new and unforeseen forms. But nothing that truly mattered had been lost. The paintings still glowed upon their walls as they glow today. The marble figures still kept their patient watch. The domes still floated over their cities. The millions upon millions of printed books could never be recalled or unwritten. And above all, the new way of seeing and of thinking and of being human had sunk far too deep into the mind of the West ever to be uprooted again, whatever any inquisitor might wish. The Renaissance had lasted, in all its length, some 200 or 300 years, and had been the work, in its glory, of only a few thousand extraordinary hands and minds, crowded into a handful of sunlit cities in a small corner of one small continent. And yet, in that short time and that narrow space, it had quietly and permanently changed the answer to the oldest question of all: what a human being is, and what a human being might become. It had taken a whole civilization that looked always upward and beyond, toward heaven, toward God, toward the life to come, past this poor vale of tears, and taught it to look also outward and around and inward, at this world, this life, this earth, this single passing self, and to find them not worthless after all, but precious and beautiful and endlessly, achingly worth knowing. And it had taken the single human being, the particular person with his own face and name and gifts and griefs and destiny, the anonymous soul the Middle Ages had left almost nameless in the crowd, and set that person, for good and for ill, at the very center of the picture in the full light where he has stood ever since, where you and I still stand today. When we stand before a lifelike painting and feel that we are gazing through an open window at a real and living scene, when we prize the education of the whole person and admire the man or woman gifted and accomplished in many things at once, when we honor the individual genius and sign our names with pride to the work of our hands, and long quietly to leave some mark that will outlast us, in every one of these things, without ever thinking of it, we are the children of the Renaissance. When we believe, as almost everyone alive now simply assumes, that knowledge can grow, that the natural world can be studied and measured and understood by patient human reason, that there are always new truths waiting just beyond the edge of what we know, for those with the courage and the method to go and find them, that great and world-remaking faith, which built our whole age of science and medicine and invention, was born in these very centuries, out of the marriage of ancient curiosity with modern daring. And when we hold in our hearts that this life, here now upon this earth under this sky, is not merely a gray shadow to be endured on the way to somewhere better, but is itself a precious and beautiful thing, worth living fully and living well. In that quiet conviction too we are the heirs of those men and women who first dared, after the long medieval night, to lift their heads and love the world again. They were not saints, the people of the Renaissance, and we should not pretend it. They could be proud and greedy and treacherous and cruel. Their brilliant age was also an age of poison and war and the slave ship and the burning stake, of terrible injustice bought and paid for. And the very soaring confidence that made them great could tip, and often did, into an arrogance that later ages have paid dearly to unlearn. They were, in the end, gloriously and terribly human, which is only to say that they were like us. But they woke a sleeping world. They lifted their eyes from the long medieval prayer and looked out at the earth and up at the heavens and inward at their own strange hearts, and dared to believe, against 1,000 years of teaching, that a human life was a small and sinful thing, that a human being and a human mind were glorious beyond measure. And in that one great act of daring they lit a fire that is burning still, in every gallery and library and laboratory and questioning mind on earth, 500 years on, tonight. So let us leave them there, at the last, in the golden evening of their extraordinary world, the painters bent close over their glowing walls and the sculptors easing their figures out of the marble, the scholars whispering among their rescued manuscripts and the printers hauling at their clattering presses, the sailors watching an unknown coastline rise from the sea, the poets in the torchlit theaters, and the lone stargazers on their dark towers with the whole sky wheeling above them, all of them bent, each in his own way, to the same great and hopeful and unfinished work, the discovery of the world and of the human being who stands wondering within it. And tonight, Let all that's striving grow quiet and gentle and far away in the dark. The great dome still floats over the red roofs of Florence, turning to gold in the last of the evening light. The marble David keeps his patient, watchful vigil in the square. The faint, mysterious smile still hangs in its quiet room, and the painted heavens still arch in their glory overhead. And far, far above them all, through a slender tube of glass, the 4 small moons of Jupiter still wheel in the dark, exactly as one old, half-blind man first saw them wheel on a cold, clear night 400 years ago. The long day's work is done now, and all its makers are long, long asleep. These many centuries, their labors ended and their striving stilled, and only their beauty left behind, glowing softly in the dark, for us. So let the lamplight dim, and the great city grow still, and let yourself now, at the end of it all, drift gently and easily down into rest. For the story is told, and all is quiet, and there is nothing left to do, and nothing left to be, but only to sleep. Good night.